afternoon, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today for our Working Lunch webinar on effective website design. We're talking today about the top ways to boost conversions so your website works the way that you want it to. Before you get started, and before we get started, if you wouldn't mind, would you mind answering our poll question? Do you think your website is using design as well as it could be? So think through designs that you've seen that you may like, your home page and your internal pages. Are they driving your visitors to do what it is that you want them to accomplish on those pages? So I'd like to introduce our panelists today, Stacy Kleber of Stacy Kleber Design. Stacy, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing your expertise to this, this particular area. I know that we lean on you pretty often when we have design questions. Would you mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I am Stacy Kleber Jensen, and I am the Chief Creative Officer of Stacy Kleber Design. I've been working in design since 2008. And I am helping businesses build successful brands and websites that communicate clearly and effectively to their audiences. I worked with a range of different clients, including the International Baccalaureate and the Smithsonian Science Education Center here in the DC area. And I've also worked with some smaller for-profit businesses like the Wilbert Group out of Atlanta. And I work both as their design arm sometimes, and also as kind of a supplement to their design branches, so that I can help their design arms of the company kind of establish better, fill out their brand. Okay.
All right. So what is it that drew you to design? What is it that you love so much about what you do?
I love being able to help people communicate what they're doing, especially now with all the things that are going on. Like, it's so important for businesses to have a clear idea of who they are and be able to communicate that through their websites and their logo designs and their branding. And I mean, it even goes into their kind of tone of voice that their companies have. All that goes into the elements of the design.
Okay, thank you. It's always exciting when we get a chance to talk, because I'm really looking forward to this conversation, because you said a lot of light on different areas of design that I think are difficult for people to, not so much difficult for people to grasp, but there are so many pieces to design that when you just look at a website, you don't always realize how much work and thought went into the design. It's not as simple as, I like that, that would work great for me, right?
That's always what happens. It's so hard to communicate to people that it's not always about what you like, it's kind of about communicating it to the audience too.
Yep, exactly. Yep, it's about not just what they like, but what's going to be most effective, what's going to grab them fastest, right? Mm-hmm. So the agenda for today, we have a pretty packed presentation for you. The agenda for today, so we're going to cover the principles of good web design across a number of different slides. We're going to talk a little bit about mobile responsive design, or mobile first. The tools that you can use to clarify your design vision for both you and whoever it is that's designing your website. And then, of course, live Q&A at the end for any questions that you have as we go through. Feel free to send through questions as we're talking through. We will answer them all at the end. So here we go. So just to get started, principles of good web design. Can you talk just for a minute, Stacy, about like the overall goal, the overall vision when you decide to rebuild your website? What is it that you should be thinking of in terms of design?
There's a lot of elements of design that go into your website, and like you have talked about a little bit before, it's not just about how it looks, but it's about how it functions too. Like, we're getting so into design thinking lately. You know, you hear a lot about that. And you have to think about how your website functions as well as how it looks. You want it to be really clear what your purpose is. You want it to be clear what you're trying to communicate, and you only have a few seconds to grab people, so it needs to be right up front.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about accomplish, you're talking about overall goals. What types of things would people be looking to accomplish through their design?
Well, it's first of all what you want to highlight, I think. So what is your goal right off the bat? Are you trying to get people to sign up for your newsletter? Are you trying to get people to purchase something? Are you trying to get people to go further into your site for more information? And then you have purposes at the bottom too of the slide, which is like your reputation, your leads, your sales. And whether or not you're just trying to get people into the conversation. Maybe you just want them to contact you and start talking so that you can then sell to them in that way.
Mm-hmm. So we hear, I think, a lot about, and I will touch on this more later, but we hear a lot about the telling a story. I think we hear more about it now than we used to. So I think when we're talking about purpose and next steps, we're really trying to tell that story so that the person can accomplish or you can grab that person as quickly as possible, right? So the pieces that I guess if I'm thinking about my homepage or I'm thinking about my design and I'm a business owner, I focus mostly on my business. I don't have a lot of time to think through what the design should be. What would you say, especially for the homepage, what would be the most important parts of the homepage that I should really devote my time and attention to as I'm thinking through what I'm trying to get people to accomplish on my website?
I think that the first thing you want to focus on is what's right up front. So I like a hero banner and your message right there, because people are going to click on, and if they don't see what they want right away, they're going to move on to the next website. So you want something right up front that's going to communicate what you do or what you want them to do or what you're trying to, I guess for lack of a better term, is sell to them, even if you're not selling like a physical shirt or something like that, like what you're trying to get across. And then also I think it's important to have your navigation right at the top so that if there is something specific they're looking for, they can see it right there and move into your site to get the information that they need. So I would say focus on your navigation and your architecture and also that first hit at the top.
Okay. All right. That's really, really helpful. So, and just, we will touch on this more later, but just for architecture, can you explain what you mean by architecture?
Basically, how you're going to travel around the site. So your navigation and then your sub-navigation, where you're going into it from there. So say you had maybe 4 different audiences, you might have something at the top and then a drop down with your 4 different audiences, and you want to focus on then what pieces of your website apply to those different audiences and move further and further in.
Okay, all right, that makes total sense. So just a last question before we move forward. There are a lot of different pieces to the homepage, a lot of different areas of the website. A lot of times I find that the footer of the website or that lower area of the website gets overlooked, but it is a very, very important part of the overall architecture and structure. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I would definitely make sure in your footer you have like a contact, probably your social icons, because when people get to the bottom, they're going to have learned everything about you and either want to connect with you, want to share, you want that stuff easily accessible in the footer. And you can also have kind of sub-navigation and additional points of interest in your footer so that people can travel within your website that may not necessarily fit into your initial navigation.
Okay, that makes total sense. If I have a new business and I'm not really selling anything, do I need to have a website? Is it important to have an online brochure online? Is it important to have a website at this stage?
I think it's always important to have a website. I think that in a lot of ways it adds a certain legitimacy, because I think people are immediately going to ask you for it, even more so than a business card at this point. I would pick a website over a physical brochure, even though I am a print designer in a lot of ways, and I love print, and I think it's so important to have those physical pieces. I think that people are going to look for the website first at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. I think the first place that I always go whenever I get a business card or whenever somebody reaches out to me online is I want to take a look. I want to understand more about who they are, and the best place to do that is usually online.
Yeah, even if it's just like a one page, it doesn't have to be an in-depth, heavy-duty site. Like, it can just be a one-page brochure type site, but it'll at least help people get a better idea of who you are without having to pick up the phone right away.
So how often does my website need to be updated? So if I put up a new website today, like, when is the next step that you would see, even if I just have a very, very simple online site? I think a lot of times we meet people who haven't updated their site for 5 years or 3 years. Is there a good rule of thumb in terms of how often I should really look over my website and make adjustments and edits?
In terms of content, I think you should refresh it whenever you notice changes. I think you should keep in mind and try to figure out whether or not your content's effective. So, like, I know in the recent blog post you talked about A/B testing, like learning what's working for your website and whether or not that's effectively communicating with your audience. And I think that if you notice something's not resonating, then it definitely needs to be updated. I don't think there's necessarily a rule of thumb in terms of years and design. I think you should kind of put something up that will last you a while, like universally. But at the same time, I think you should keep an eye out on what the trends are, because if it starts to look dated, then I think people are going to also associate your business with being dated as well. And so I think you need to kind of have a little bit of a finger on the pulse of what's going on. But I don't think every 6 months you need a new website. It's just not realistic.
Okay. All right. Nope, that makes total sense. And I think that helps a lot of people to kind of breathe a sigh of relief, because, the website design, it's a big endeavor. No matter how small the website is, there are a lot of steps involved to make sure it goes up properly. So knowing that you should keep it updated, but you don't have to, modernize every 6 months or every year. It's just important to keep it updated. I think that's an excellent rule of thumb. So in terms of simplicity, keeping it simple, through the color and the images and the typography, I know it's a goal, but it can be a struggle, because a lot of people, you have a lot of words, you just have a lot of background, you want your website to stand out. So how can you help your website to stand out, but still keep it simple? And what does keeping it simple mean on a website?
So in terms of colors, I definitely agree with what's on the slide, 5 colors or less. And you want to have one dominant color, which is kind of what this is alluding to. The orange is like the big color, and then you want to have a brand or supplementary colors like the gray and the green. You want to not overdo it with color, because it's going to get very busy very fast. And not every color is going to apply to your brand. You want to make sure you're thinking about what the color communicates. So, I just had somebody email me, and they were talking about how they wanted something that was like a calming color for their logo. And so immediately, I personally would think like green and blue. You don't think red, colors that are kind of like agitating and powerful. You're thinking more subtle colors. Green is like a nature color. Blue is like a water color. So you want to make sure that the colors that you're using are communicating your message. And also, you want to avoid, so you want like a pop color usually, but you want to avoid having that be the dominant color unless your audience is maybe like super modern or super young. So like I wouldn't make a whole website orange if you were dealing with some kind of a government buttoned up blue collar agency. You know, you want to think about maybe just using that as a pop color to make things stand out.
Mm-hmm. So then regardless of what your brand colors are, obviously you stay within your brand colors, but when it comes to your website or your collateral, you're really thinking about your target audience when you're choosing the primary and secondary colors. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, that makes total sense. So what about the typography and the images? I mean, I think we see, images are a whole separate conversation, but for the typography, I think that sometimes when we get on a website, at least when I get on a website, sometimes everything is very, very clear. I can clearly read what's there. Other times, certain scripts, there are certain fonts that play with my eyes. I can't see as well on mobile. Is there a good rule of thumb for the types of fonts to use? And can you explain a little bit about the types of fonts, like a serif versus a sans serif font, and how it's best to use those?
Sure. So a serif font was originally developed for print, and the idea was that the serifs kind of lead your eye into the next letter. So that typography on the slide, that would be a serif font. While it was really good for printing and for news and things like that, when you get on a website, because everything's made up of all these pixels, a lot of times it got a little bit harder to read, especially when screens were not as great quality as they are today. So on screen, we generally recommend, at least for body copy, for main paragraphs and things like that, a sans serif font, which is the sans serif in the serif versus sans serif, or even the body copy that we're using on the slides. That said,
I've heard it described as feet or without feet. So like the serif font, it has little feet, and sans serif is without feet. That's usually how I identify right away.
So we definitely recommend sans serif. That said, like, you don't have to stay away from serif. It really makes a good contrast for headlines and for call outs. What else is that font? And so if you do have a logo that's a serif font, like, you don't have to totally avoid using it. I would say use it, and they're good for headlines and body copy because they offer a lot of contrast. So it's really easy for people to see, like, this is your headline and this is your body.
So what about your online fonts versus your paid fonts, something that you would pay for that would be a little bit more customized? Do you have a recommendation of our Google fonts, online fonts? Are those okay to use?
We would generally stick with Google fonts because there's a lot of complicated licensing things around fonts. So your like print fonts, the fonts that you would use in Word and things like that, they can be something that you have to pay for and then buy specific software to install onto your website so that everybody can see them. There's also a certain amount of like using universal fonts. So Google fonts are embedded in, almost everybody will see them. If you pick something kind of obscure that you install yourself and you ask it to pull up that font, it may not see it. So there's a traditional way of like looking at it, like there's your traditional online fonts. Georgia is a universal font because most all computers have it. Arial is a universal font because almost all computers have it. But with the development of Google Fonts, we've been able to expand on that a lot and be able to use things that are a lot more interesting and diverse than just sticking with your traditional fonts.
The fonts make it a lot more fun.
Yes. And also, what I was going to say before I forgot was that I don't recommend using like scripty fonts, like handwriting type fonts very much. Maybe use it as little as possible if you're going to use it at all online, because it's going to be really hard to see on mobile.
Okay. All right. That's an excellent observation. I think depending on the industry or depending on what it is that you're selling or what your business is, sometimes we have a tendency to default to the fonts that we like or the fonts that we would use in maybe our prints, in our prints. But when it comes to online, there are some really clear considerations, and, being able to read things well on both mobile and on desktop, I think is one of the top considerations, because if you can't read what your site is about, then regardless of what else you do, layout or images, it's you're unlikely to convert that person. So just talking for a moment about images. So images, it's not just the pictures, right? It's can you tell me a little bit about what goes into the images on the site? What are images on my site?
So images on your site can be anything from photography to illustration to video. And I mean, depending on how you use it, sometimes even a big letter or something like that can be an image block in the shape. Websites have a lot of icons now. We see a lot of that. And you want to pay attention to how much they move, how much is moving, how you're distracting people, and where you're getting them from. There's a lot of stuff about usage. You can't just pull an image offline. You have to use a stock image or an image that you established yourself or an image that you've cleared the rights to. There's a lot of good resources like Unsplash for free images that are super helpful.
So from an image perspective, would you recommend using Unsplash, or would you recommend using paid stock photography if we're going to use stock photography?
I always recommend using paid stock photography because I know that there's no guarantees ever where the images came from and whether or not they really cleared the rights to them. I also think if you choose well, that you're going to get a more diverse image from a stock website. At the same time, you don't want to pick things that are contrived. So like, it's really hard when you look for business people. You don't want that person standing there smiling, staring at the camera, perfectly posed. You want to try to find more natural looking images. And you can use the images to drive people to different areas of your site. So instead of having somebody look directly at the camera, maybe they're looking at your headline. And that is automatically driving your eye to the headline versus distracting people with that specific image.
Okay, that makes sense. I think also, when it comes to photography, it's important to consider if it's possible for you to actually hire a photographer and bring a photographer in to represent your business whenever possible. I mean, it's good to use a mixture of, it's good to use stock photography, but it's nice to have a mixture of your own images. Is that right, to use a mixture if possible, or does it not matter if we have a photographer?
I mean, I think you can do that one if you have to, but if you can, the images are going to be so much more authentic if you're using images of your own staff and your own space and your own product.
And if you're purchasing images, or even if you do have a photographer come in, usually when these images are added to your website, are they added as is? Are they retouched? Like, what do you do when you actually get the images and you're moving them into a website? What needs to happen with them?
It really depends on how you want to use it. hopefully your photographer will have, if you hired a photographer, hopefully the photographer will have retouched them, at least to clean them up, to get them the way you want, take out anything that doesn't fit. If you do need something edited, we can buy stock. Sometimes we can manipulate and layer stock so that it looks different. And then you can also add effects. Maybe you want it to be grayscale and you want it to be screened in blue or purple or whatever your company brand is. We can definitely do that kind of editing too. So, and stuff like that can make it stand out too. Then it's not just your typical stock photo that you pulled off. It's not going to look like everybody else's because we've manipulated it to make it more interesting. I think the idea is, as best you can, don't just pull stuff off, but kind of make something that's your own,
Yeah, make it really stand out on your site. So just to wrap up this portion of it, can you tell me a little bit about what branding guidelines are, what brand style guidelines are? How do I, if I'm working with a web designer, what is the best way to explain what my brand is supposed to look like?
So hopefully if you've had your logo done by a professional designer, you have some kind of brand standard. You want to hand over your logo and any guidelines on the fonts that were used in the logo or the fonts that they recommend using in your print and web work. You also want to hand over any kind of image guidelines. So a lot of times brands establish image guidelines that will say, we use people looking at the camera, or we only use natural looking photography, or we only use advertorial type photography. And that is helpful as well. Maybe your brand uses illustrations, maybe you never use illustrations for the audience, and so we shouldn't use that. Those kind of things really help us pick out what we can use when we're designing your site.
Can this be done at the same time as my site design? So if you were to begin designing a site, would you be able to do the brand guidelines and style guide first and then move into the website? Or do you recommend this be done ahead of time?
It can be done either way. I think it can be done while you're working on your site. If you don't have something established and you hand us over a logo, we can definitely figure out what will go with that and make recommendations on color palettes. And then you can, so if the website is the first thing you're doing, you don't have business cards, you don't have brochures or anything like that, I mean, it's a great starting point for picking out your colors, picking out your fonts, and figuring out what communicates well with your audience.
Mm-hmm. I find that to be a lot of fun whenever we get a chance to take a look at existing or we get to create new brand guidelines. It's always wonderful to see what comes together, and then when it comes to actually moving into the website build, it just makes things much easier. So you can focus on other areas versus trying to figure out these decisions.
I mean, it's fun both ways. It's fun. I worked as an in-house designer for a while, and it's fun to figure out how to challenge that brand and make it fresh when you're already in constraints. But it's also really fun to build that brand yourself, which is why I love working on logos and kind of helping people figure out what their look is.
So am I stuck with my brand guidelines forever if we get started with it, or do brands change over time?
Brands can definitely change over time, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to totally refresh your logo, although you may. And refreshing your logo can be anything from starting over to taking existing pieces and kind of building on those. So you don't need to start from scratch all the time to give yourself a new look.
Okay, so I think that's definitely a topic for a future conversation, and is really being able to talk about the brand guidelines, because I think we could go on for a lot longer about this, but we have so much to cover today. So let's start moving into the other areas of what goes into the website design. So let's talk about the navigation. I mean, we started talking about the architecture, the navigation, simplicity. I guess, can you just can you talk a little bit about what's important in the navigation, in the types of navigations? Because there's not just one type of navigation, right?
So usually when you're in the top of a website, you expect to see the logo either top right or center because of the way your eye is going to read through the page. And then you want to have your navigation at the top. Normally for a desktop site, you're going to actually see the words, you know, like you're going to read home, about, contact, and you want to stick with, I would say, between 5 and 7 at most navigation items, because you don't want to bog people down in trying to find things and making it really difficult. Then a lot of times you'll have a hamburger menu for mobile. So when your navigation disappears and you see the 3 little lines on the top right, that's a hamburger menu. And for mobile, it's because we don't have enough screen area across the top to be able to show you all the different links and still make them big enough to click. So it condenses down to that little corner. People are familiar with it. I mean, it's become pretty universal at this point. They're going to know what to do. It'll click and slide and you'll get your navigation item. There's also navigation sometimes in the footer. You can have a navigation tree in your footer that kind of outlines everywhere in the site. You can have secondary navigation in the footer where you're calling out different things than you called out at the top to make sure your visitor sees all of the things. And then sometimes there's even like a 3rd layer of navigation on the top or the bottom that includes your social icons and like smaller pages. So not as important as your primary navigation, but still things that people are going to be interested in.
Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of times what we do with navigations is we'll separate out the most important client pages, like your home page, if you have different types of services, you lay out those services as the primary navigation, and then the other pages that people might be interested in would be your about page, but about page wouldn't necessarily be a primary navigation page if you have a lot of items that are going into your navigation. Is that right? What other pages would you consider secondary that wouldn't necessarily go right up front and center in your primary navigation?
I think about is definitely one. If you have something that's not necessarily related directly, so maybe you have a conference or
resources?
I would definitely
like resources, blogs,
yeah,
these
resources.
type would these would be in a secondary area. Okay. Would contact would that go on a primary navigation? Would that go on a secondary navigation above it?
I would typically, I've seen it in both places. I would typically make it a primary navigation item because it's important, because people need to be able to contact you right away. And what you might put above is a phone number or a link to an email if you want to have an extra navigation item above, because I think that helps people get in touch with you right there versus having contact and then going into another page.
Okay, which makes total sense. I think I think, you know, a good rule of thumb, and, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a good rule of thumb is, you know, think through, again, the story. So the same story that you're trying to tell on your home page plays into your navigation. If you have specific services, then, you know, those would be primary. You really want people to go to those because these are focusing on the other person. They're focusing on your visitor. Pages that are more focused on you or help support your visitor in some way, but isn't a primary focus, these should go on a secondary in a secondary location. Is that right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And okay, so one last question about navigation before we move forward. Home button, add it or do not add it?
I don't think it's necessary. Generally, people know at this point that your logo will take them back home. I think it's just extra words. But I don't know, what have you seen in terms of what's going on with the analytics?
Same thing. People usually can figure out that, that the navigation, that the logo takes them back to the home. But when it comes to analytics, I think that part of it also depends on your audience, your target audience, and the people that actually come to your site. If you have a lot of, it depends on the age group. So if you have a lot of people that are, maybe above 50, above 60, then at that point, they may sometimes be looking for that home button versus looking for the logo. At least that's some of what we see. So a lot of it depends on the audience, I think. But I think also for the most part, adding the home button in many cases, you're taking away from the quote unquote real estate that you have, the space that you have at the very top. So if you're wasting it with a home, and a home doesn't need to be there, you really shouldn't have more than 5 to 7 navigation links on your primary navigation. So if you end up needing that extra space and you have your home, I think you can feel comfortable to remove it, right?
Yeah, that was my thought. If you're going to need the space, then it's easy enough to knock it off and make the logo. I'd rather you focus on getting your audience where they need to go, because they can always go home,
Versus sending them back home. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so please go to contact us, don't go back to home. So, all right, so let's talk about the website itself, like when somebody jumps onto a website and they're looking over a web page, can you talk a little bit about the design for scanning versus reading? Do people actually read the content on a website?
I don't think anybody reads in depth the content on a website. You want your website to be more kind of chunky advertisements, then you want it to be a white paper that people are going to sit and read from top to bottom. So most of the time they're going to scan, which is why we talked a little bit earlier about having something at the top that is a direct call to action. Here is who I am, and click here to find out more. And then maybe they'll move down and they'll want to learn more about you, and they'll see maybe a blurb. I think especially for the homepage, like, excerpts are way more effective than having a whole bunch of things that people read, because you want to hit them with it, but at the same time, if they want to learn more, they can always click into your website. So maybe you have a couple lines about yourself, and then you're like, learn more about me, and it goes to the about page. That's way more effective than trying to fill people's screens with your entire work history right up front.
So what if I have a lot of copy and I can't cut it down? How would you recommend displaying that on a website? Are there ways to show a little bit of copy and then have it expand or open up in other ways, so maybe all of it doesn't show at once? Or would you recommend always actually cutting it down?
I mean, cut down as much as you can, but at the same time, if you have a lot of content, there's things like accordion menus that will allow you to have the content hide and then show up when you click. So accordion menus kind of fold down when you're not using them, and then when you click on one of the headlines, it moves down and all your content's there. So you aren't hitting people with maybe 5 huge paragraphs of content at once. You're hitting them with 1 paragraph of content, and then they can click on the next topic and you'll get another paragraph of content. And it's slightly more streamlined way of presenting stuff to your audience. You can also use pop-up boxes. So say you had a page about your team and you wanted to just show their photo and maybe their phone number and their email. You could have it so that you clicked on the photo and the box came up. It's like a pop-up box with all their information. This is what they do. This is what they focus on. So you can have it there but still have it kind of hidden so that you're not overwhelming your audience.
Mm-hmm. And I think another good thing to, to point out is the fact that a paragraph of text on a page looks very different than a paragraph of text on a web page, right? Like a sentence or two on a web page can look almost like a paragraph. So when you're thinking about cutting down the copy that you have, look at it in terms of sentences, not literally paragraphs, because one paragraph can sometimes take up an entire page if the words are placed right. Is that correct?
You also have to think about how it's going to look on mobile. So when the page condenses down, like 1 or 2 sentences can be a pretty long scroll versus if you had a whole paragraph, 10 or 11 sentences, I mean, you're going to go way into your phone before you get to the next section. So I think you have to think about whether or not you want all that content when people are looking at it on their small screens as well.
Also, breaking up the content with call to actions with, call to action, I would say, can you talk a little bit about call to actions and what they are and how these might display on a web page?
Call to actions are pieces of text that are going to stand out more. They may be a link that you click. They may be a tagline that tries to get you to do something in the site. So call me, email me, read more, all those things are call to actions. And you want them to stand out, and you're trying to guide your user through the site in the way that you want them to use your site. So you want to make sure they know, like, here's where you can see my events. Here's where you can call me. Here's the calendar. And kind of guide them into those different sections based on how you want them to use the site.
That makes total sense. I think when we're on a website, now that you have this information, I think when you go back to a website, if you go back to your website, take a look and see how you're directing people on your site. And then when you're on other people's sites, take a look and see how they're directing people on their sites, what types of call to actions you're seeing now that you can call them out and see what they're for. So the hierarchy of a page, when you're designing the page itself, so we're talking about home page and internal pages. So I guess my first question is, do all these pages, do they look the same? And how much similarity should they have? Like, should all internal pages be exactly the same? Should the home page be the template and then everything else should follow the home page? How do you think through what these different pages should look like overall?
The home page is kind of the starting point, I would say. And it's almost like your, I don't know, for lack of a better, it's like your book cover. It's got all the things that you want people to see right away. And it's going to tell your story, almost like the back of a book cover where you get the synopsis. Here's a little bit about this, here's a little bit about that. And it's probably going to be the heaviest designed page. It's going to have the most images. It's going to be the flashiest. When you start moving into the site, the pages are going to be probably a bit more text and a bit less image. You should definitely keep the header consistent. I would say the navigation should always be at the top. It should always be in the same place. The logo should be in the same place. A lot of times with interiors, we kind of keep some sort of hero image at the top, even if it's not quite as tall as the homepage hero image, but then a lot simpler in terms of the content, more text, less image, less advertising looking on the interior pages.
Okay, so just really quick, when you say hero image, so hero, of course, I'm thinking about Superman with his hands on his hips. So when you say hero image, what do you mean by hero image so that everybody can get a good mental picture?
Hero image, well, at this point, I guess, can be either an image or a video, because we're seeing more of video. It could even really be an illustration, but it's that big first image at the top of your page. Most of the time it's going to be full width, and you're going to have some kind of a call to action, and probably some kind of a button to like learn more or move down the site. And it's the thing that's really going to grab your attention right up front. You want it to be nice, clear, contemporary, and you want it to kind of be that thing that's going to reflect your business. Almost like a logo, but an image. You know, it's like you want it to really embody your company right up front. And when you move into the site, a lot of times we keep that space because it's a good space for a title or a call to action, but we truncate it a little bit so that it's not quite as dominant as it is on the homepage.
Okay. All right. No, I think that was a perfect explanation. The way that you said, I can visualize it perfectly. And I think that, you know, everybody, when you jump onto a website, more often than not, you're going to see an image at the top representing, not just on the homepage, but usually on the internal pages as well, as you already noted.
So it's easier to catch somebody's attention with an image versus just a block of text. So I think it makes sense that people are super visual and they're going to want to see that at the beginning.
So what about hero image versus hero color with text? Like, is there a rule of thumb versus using color at the top with text versus using an image? Would you say homepage versus interior pages would be different? What's your thought for that?
I think you could use a hero color. I've seen sites that do some kind of a color or a gradient or a pattern at the top. I think the important thing with that is that you have really effective text because there's nothing else to distract people. You know, you really have to have a good like catch at the top. So
good copywriter.
If your content is weak, then you're going to lose people.
Because effective writing, as you know, as it says on the side, effective writing, it's part of the design. It's not just, these are not independent pieces. The writing absolutely supports and plays into the design as the design, the content, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's not just, well, from a design standpoint, the block of text is almost a piece of the design. So you need to know how much content you're going to need to design the space effectively.
Yep, that's an excellent point. So when it comes to effective copy, so in your opinion, I have my own opinion on this, of course, but in your opinion, is the business owner the best person to finalize the copy, not necessarily write, but edit and finalize the copy for the site and for the design, in your experience?
I would say it's good for them to review it, but I think that it's almost better to have somebody external looking at it because in the end, you're too close to it.
Yep.
And you may not see what the audience sees, or you may be missing something inherent that you think everybody understands that they don't.
Yes, I know. Yeah, I think that happens a lot. Like we're all experts in our own subject matter, So when it comes to writing our own copy, we can explain everything, but then making sure that it grabs the person in that 5 seconds or less. I think sometimes, you know, quite often we're just too close to it and we can't. So having somebody that is good at editing the copy and, you know, bringing the attention and the focus to where it needs to be, I think is a really important part of thinking through your website design. And, you know, especially with small businesses, it's not always possible, but it doesn't have to be a huge engagement. It doesn't have to be, okay, they're going to write all of my copy. It could just be, you know, 4 to 5 hours of somebody just being able to go through, understand what you're looking for, and then editing it down for you, and then being able to work with the designer to provide that copy to make sure that it fits into the layout that's being created. So any other thoughts about writing or copy before we move on and talk a little bit more about layout?
I just think it's important to factor it all in the beginning. So like keep in mind so that it all is harmonious. Like your picture should make sense with your copy, and you don't want your voice to come across different than your design voice, your brand voice, you know?
Yeah, I think that's excellent. That's excellent. I think that's really helpful. You know, the voice and the tone, all of these different pieces. You know, it's sometimes we wait. We say, okay, well, you know, I'm going to get them working on the design, and then I'm going to think through and work on the copy while they're working on their part. I'm going to do my part. But, you know, that's not the most effective way to do it, because in the end, you may not end up with the exact balance that you were looking for. So there is a hierarchy. There are a number of steps to accomplish at the beginning before actually moving forward into the design piece. So, I mean, talking about organizing the design, organizing the content, you know, one of my favorite things about using WordPress as a platform is that, you know, whatever theme it is that's being used or however the design is being placed, typically you will see a grid structure. So can you talk a little bit about the grid structure, why it's important to use a grid style structure versus just placing things on the page?
So one of the great things about the grid structure, I know we go into mobile later, but like the grid structure is the best thing for working with mobile, because you have everything in its own little container. And then when you shrink it for iPad, you know, like, so the one we're looking at right now, I would say if you shrunk it for iPad, you would probably get 2 columns out of 3. And then if you shrunk it for a phone, you get 1 column out of 3, and all the other pieces would just kind of like shift down and fall into place. It makes your job so much easier. You also have to keep in mind that everybody's screen size is slightly different. So the grid structure will a lot of times be a percentage, you know, like 33% of the page, so 1/3. And as it spreads, everything will kind of adjust to fit the space. If you think that you want something in a specific spot all the time, it's not going to happen. That's the difference between web and print. You know, when I work on a print project, I know when I put it there, that's where it's going to be. It's not going anywhere. Everybody's going to see it that way. With websites, it's a lot more complicated, because depending on the screen size, I may hard code something to a specific spot, and it may look fine on mine, and on somebody else's, maybe the words shift, and all of a sudden that piece is not where I thought it was going to be, and it doesn't look right. It looks broken. So if you can stay within that mobile grid, it's so much easier to move things around.
Yeah, no, that's perfect, and that takes us right into the mobile first approach. So, I guess when you're thinking through mobile, you're starting with, you know, you're starting with your grid structure, your grid layout. You're paying attention to how much copy is going into it. Can you just talk a little bit about why mobile first is so important, and I mean, from a design standpoint, anything that we haven't already talked about that you should really pay attention to when you're thinking through your mobile design, and at what point you should start thinking about mobile?
We should start
a lot of questions in there, sorry.
You should start thinking about mobile right from the beginning. I mean, that's why it's called mobile first. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't design in a mobile grid first, but I design my desktop with mobile in mind. So I make sure that I know that I have columns, and I know that's going to move down, or that button is big enough that when somebody clicks on it on mobile, their fingers aren't going to be too big. You know, like, it's got to be big enough for people to be able to easily touch it and interact with it. And it's important because so many people now are using their phones and also iPads. I mean, iPad mini, all these things that are way smaller than our movie-sized desktop screens. And generally, like, these are where people are now. You know, people are taking iPads over their computer at times. Some people don't have computers. Maybe a tablet is the only thing they own. And so by keeping in mind mobile and phone, you want to make sure that it's easy for people to interact with on there, because that's where they are, especially phone. I mean, you know, if you're out and somebody sees your, I don't know, your flyer or your business card, they're going to pick it up and they're going to be like, well, let me look him up on my phone. And if they can't interact with your website on their phone, they're going to just bounce it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that happens pretty often, you know, like, because you're not, you know, you'll jump on a website and then you won't find what you're looking for immediately because there's either too much copy or there's not a good call to action, or that just hasn't been thought through effectively. And I think part of that is testing, because there are so many different types of mobile devices that when you're launching or when you're designing, you need to consider, you know, whether it's going to be, what size is the screen and what orientation. So is it going to be landscape or sideways? Is it going to be, you know, portrait or vertical? And how everything is going to place and land based on the screen that they're actively using. And then once it's built, actually be able to test that. So yeah, mobile first, I think, is very important. And to your point, you know, while it's important to consider the design in mobile, it's okay to start in desktop, because desktop, I think a lot of times this is where our minds go. We want to see the whole picture, and the whole picture is usually seen on desktop.
I mean, for me, it's easier to think about scaling down than it is scaling up. That's just how my brain functions. So I would rather see 3 across and think about it stacking down than see 3 down and think about trying to maneuver it backwards.
Yep. And you say stacking down. So, you know, that's an excellent point. It's the fact, when you have columns, usually what will happen is, you know, these columns are going to fall beneath. So it's not going to fall to the very bottom of the screen. They're not going to disappear, and they're not going to get smaller and go sideways. They are going to stack. So instead of one column, you now have 3, instead of 3 columns, you now have 1, but they're stacked on top of each other. So if your column that you create if it's really big, then you have 3 really big columns stacking on top of each other. So when you're thinking about these different pieces for mobile, think about, you know, that's one of the reasons, I guess, like you said, to cut down the copy, cut down the information, so that when they do stack, it's not difficult to be able to manage on mobile.
And you don't have to have the exact same experience necessarily. I mean, you want it to feel like a consistent experience, but it may be that you know, some things disappear, just like the navigation, you know, it becomes a hamburger menu. It doesn't have to be the exact same literal experience. You want them to have the same feeling of the experience.
That's an excellent point. So when it comes to actually designing and coding the site, you can make it so that it appears different on mobile, you know, within reason. Like you said, same feeling, you know, a similar experience, but it doesn't always have to be the exact same experience. So we have a lot of tools, right? We have a lot of tools that we use in order to be able to better visualize or help people better visualize what things will look like or what the layout will look like. So some of the ones that we talked about here were wireframes and mock-ups. Can you talk a little bit about the benefit of a wireframe, of a mock-up, how exactly that works, and who should create that?
So a wireframe is super simplified version of your website. Actually, I see it in the corner, the top right corner of the slide. So it is basically placeholders for all the things. So if you have an image, you're going to have a box where the image will go. And if you're going to have a paragraph of text or 3 lines of text, you're going to have 3 lines of lorem ipsum. And it's about planning the space so that when it goes into design, the designer knows where everything's going to go. I guess the wireframe is kind of like planning the experience before actually visualizing it. Your actual mock-up, we usually do an actual mock-up because it's so much easier to make edits in a flat piece than it is to have the developer go in and spend time doing all these nuancy things once it's already built and coded. So we prefer to get it exactly the way you want it right off the bat, so that once it goes to the developer, they know exactly what to do. We don't have to spend time, and basically it ends up being really costly for the client to be making all these edits in the code. So the actual mockup has your actual pictures. Hopefully, if we already have your content, we can put in the actual content so you can see how it's going to fit in the space. And we'll start pulling in logos, your colors, and everything to get the experience of the site, but in one long flat page.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify roles a little bit, so developers, a typical developer, the preference is to follow a set of decisions that's already been put out. They don't want to have to make decisions while they're actually developing. They want to follow the rules based on the mock-up, based on the wireframe. So they're not thinking about it. Their job is to put it together, make everything work. So the more that you can get accomplished before it actually goes to the developer, to your point, it's going to be not as costly, of course, if they have to go in and continue to make changes. But also, it provides a better overall experience from the beginning of the project to the end of the project, because there's a whole lot less back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of questions. So is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of anything that we've already covered before we walk through the takeaways and move into questions?
I don't think so. I think because we're getting close on time, maybe let's start questions.
Mm-hmm. All right. Sounds good. All right. So just really quick, high level, key takeaways. Keeping the design simple will provide the best user experience. The design is not just about the look and feel. There are many considerations for a design that will sell. Mobile-friendly designs and layouts are essential, and planning is key. Work with a designer to create a mock-up of your new site to ensure the best experience for your visitors. And now let's go ahead and get started with the questions. So what is the best way for a non-designer to convey their vision to you when getting ready to build a new site?
So when we start building, the first thing I like to ask is, I like to get their brand guidelines. We talked a little bit about that already today. But I also like to see sites that you like. So we usually look at sites that you like and talk about why you like different elements. And then we also talk about your competitors, because it's really useful to see what other people in your industry are doing in order to make sure that we're covering all our bases. You may want to be like them. You may not want to be like them at all. It may be like, everybody's doing this. I want to look nothing like this. But you also want to consider whether or not they're doing that because it's the most effective way to get your point across.
Excellent point. How do you handle animations and dynamic content or graphics when you're putting the design strategy together?
You have to consider, I guess for me, consider how busy it is. Busy meaning like distracting for the eye. So sometimes we'll mock it up and show you. So if we're going to do a hover, maybe we'll show you one with the mouse over and one without the mouse over, so that you can kind of see how that's going to interact. A lot of times we also just talk through it. So we may look at sites and be like, oh, we want it to react this way, and this is how this block is going to act. And I think it just depends. It's hard to show it in the mock-up. It's a lot easier to show it once we start development.
Mm-hmm. And this is, I think just to follow up on that, I mean, this is just part of the process on our side. So it doesn't usually so much come back to the client. This is all behind the scenes. So it's not just about figuring out the design, figuring out placement. It's also figuring out for the developer what everything is supposed to do, what we expect to happen when somebody clicks, or, you know, when somebody hovers. You know, there are design considerations there as well. So every small project there's still big projects. There's a whole lot of considerations. So next question. How can I talk to multiple audiences on my site and still keep it simple?
I think part of that is that kind of blocking out on the homepage. So I think you can almost create pathways for the different audiences. So for example, if you are a community college and you have to talk to educators and you have to talk to students and prospective students, you can kind of have 3 or 4 different pathways that they can start to enter into so that you're not talking to them all on the homepage.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. So, you know, I guess it goes back to telling that story or using your navigation effectively. So maybe your primary navigation would reach out to each individual audience as a pathway, or, you know, the homepage layout, you talked about the different audiences there, and then the goal would be to drive them deeper into the site, right? Like I think. And then
each audience could almost have like each audience could almost have like a mini homepage, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. So if you bring your, go ahead.
No, like their own landing page, right, where they would land and get all the information they needed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think for me that always sounds like fun. Like, okay, this is an audience. I have specific things that I really want to talk to them about. So how can I make this page really stand out to that particular audience?
It's definitely fun to have more in-depth internal pages.
Mm-hmm. Should we be spending the same amount of time on internal pages as we are on the homepage?
As an audience, or as someone who's developing it?
As in the thinking through the design of the interior pages, is it as important to think through the design of the interior pages as it is the homepage?
I think it's important to think it all through. I mean, especially based on, you know, we're just talking about kind of having like mini homepages. You know, something like that's going to be a lot more effective than just sending someone to a page with a whole lot of content that they have to dig through. Just because your homepage is well thought out and simple, it doesn't mean that you don't have to pay attention to the interior pages, because people are going into them for more information. And if they get bogged down on those pages, they're going to bounce on to the next site too. So I think you need to really think through your entire site and consider how people are going to interact even when you get further in.
And I think that if your site is organized well, a lot of times search engines now will show not just your homepage when your results come up, but it'll also show the interior pages underneath. So people won't necessarily always be clicking through on your homepage. You may get people that are clicking through directly to interior pages.
That's an interesting point too.
So for font pairing, so I've heard about font pairing. How do I know what fonts go together and what fonts don't go together? And is this a decision that I should be making, or is this a decision I should be talking to somebody else about?
I would say that's a decision to talk to a designer about, only because it's slightly difficult. I mean, a lot of times, so rule of thumb is contrast. So if you have a serif and you want to pair a font with it, you would use something like a sans serif, so that was very clearly different. If you're using two very similar fonts, people aren't going to understand the difference. I mean, I know a lot of people that are kind of like almost font blind, like they don't understand that two different fonts are different. It's like different for a designer because we're trained to pick up on all these different things. But also you have to think about the personality of the font. And generally when you're pairing things, so if you're pairing a serif and a sans serif, you still want them to have a similar shape. Like you wouldn't want to pair something that's super symmetrical with something that's not super symmetrical, because they just don't feel harmonious together. And that's why I said it's good to consult a designer because there's a lot of nuances that go into typography.
Yeah, and there are a lot of fonts available.
That's like that's a whole hour in itself.
Another conversation. Well, all right. So, but when it comes to picking a font, so if I decide that I don't want to work with an online font or Google font, and I purchase the font, if you don't have it on your computer, will the font default to what they have available, or they be able to see my website as it was designed?
It will generally default to whatever somebody has available. So usually you pick like families when you do a website, and you'll say if Gil Sans is not available, then I want it to be Helvetica. And if Helvetica is not available, then I want it to be Arial. And if Arial is not available, then it should default to a sans serif. So usually you'd have those kind of options in the back end. And so when it got to somebody's site, or when it got to somebody's computer, they'd pull it up and it'll be like, okay, do they have this? No. Do they have this? Yes. Okay, we show it in that. Do they not have that? Okay, then we go to the next level. So you don't have a lot of control when you're picking super specific fonts, unless you're going to go and get really expensive, crazy licenses so that it's embedded and everybody can see it.
And one of the other things that I've noticed is that sometimes these fonts that are not online fonts, they take a little bit longer to load. So when you think about loading time and you want people to visually see your design as quickly as possible, that extra second or two that it takes to load, that the font doesn't look quite right, it can be harmful, I think, to converting to people, keeping people on your site. So the right type of image format, should I be using more icons and graphics or more images? What's the best way to use each type?
I think it really depends on your brand. Some people aren't going to use any photography, and some people aren't going to use any illustration. It really depends on your audience. In terms of type, if you're using illustrations, usually you would use a PNG, and the benefit of that is that the file type is not quite as large, and usually you have some kind of a clear background, so you can put it on your site and you don't have to worry about that white box around it. For images, I would say JPEG, because you've got a lot of rich colors. But I would definitely think about optimizing those for loading time, because a site that takes a long time to load, like you said, people aren't going to hang around. And I usually, we would be able to kind of do a recommendation on that and truncate it down so it's optimal size while still being clear. And when it comes to PNGs, these are typically also very large. So if you're working with a lot of illustrations, then, I guess you want to make sure that you have a healthy balance, or you're really paying attention to how many illustrations or PNGs you're using on a single page, because they will take up more space and take longer to load if you have a lot of them. You can also keep in mind, I don't know if it's as well known, but the SVGs can be really good too now, because they're not pixel heavy.
Excellent point. So what is an SVG?
An SVG is the web version of it. Well, and now I don't know if Flavia knows that either, but the web version of an EPS. So it's a vector, and the way I understand it is it's almost saved as code. And so when it loads, it's code, not pixels. Does that, I mean, is that your understanding?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Okay.
That's perfect. So would it be more effective to focus on the visual layout, regardless of how much content I have, meaning edit my content to fit the visual layout, or edit my visual layout to effectively display all my content? What's your opinion?
There's got to be a balance between the two. I think that you need to keep in mind the space that you need for the content, but I think that you need to be flexible as well. So when you get into it, if it's just not working, then there has to be some kind of ability to edit down to fit the design as well. I think it's a harmony thing. You know, you can't have one without the other.
And I think that from a tool perspective, you know, this is where the wireframe can be really helpful because, you know, you're not focused on colors there or images, you're just focused on placement of everything. So being able to have your actual copy fit into the wireframe will give you a really good idea when it comes to design, if you have too much or too little, before you actually get to the exciting point of pulling it all together and seeing what it's going to look like. So when should I begin working on my copies? I know we already talked a little bit about this, but when should I begin working on my copy? When is it needed in the design? And basically I already answered this, but did you have any other thoughts in terms of the copy or when you're working on a project with somebody, you know, is there a point that you're going to say, okay, we really can't move forward until I know what the copy is going to look like?
I mean, really, copy can come towards the end if it has to, but the reality is that you're going to be backing into it, if that makes sense. I'd rather have it as soon as possible because it helps me better figure out how big things need to be, how much space you need, so I can make the design more effective for you right up front. I mean, if you have it for the wireframe, that's the best because we can set up the wireframes with that in mind, and then knowing what content you have makes it easier for me to pick images as a designer too, and try to figure out what that section is going to look like.
Yep, that makes total sense. That makes
so
total
really
sense.
The earlier the better. I mean, I would say maybe you could figure out your navigation, then work on the copy, then work on the design.
And then the copy, I guess if we're going page by page, you know, if you want your project to move along faster and you haven't had time to work on everything, then at least starting with the homepage copy and getting that in place, and then moving to the interior pages allows you to be able to move forward and, you know, help them make decisions. All right, so we're down to the last two questions. Thank you so much for your time today. So is there a thing as too many call to actions? Like, are we thinking that, you know, are these ads and pop-ups, you know, are they completely different, and is more good or is more better to help to guide your audience to where you want them to on your site? So that's kind of a, you know, it's a big question, but I think that it sums up to is there such a thing as too many call to actions?
I think everything can't be important. So I think there is such a thing as too many call to actions, because if you try to make everything on your page a call to action, then nobody's going to know where to look. I think you should limit it to maybe one or two per screen. So like say you were scrolling down, I would only want one call to action in the top section. And then when that disappeared and I got to the second section, maybe one call to action there. If you make everything red, nothing stands out, you know, that's just how it works.
And the types also, right? Like if one call to action is a button and then the next call to action is it's just a text link, that helps to create a balance as well if there is more than one call to action needed in a section. Is that
Yeah,
right?
you definitely need to have some kind of a hierarchy. So, you're right. Maybe there is a link and then a button link. And people are going to look at the button link first. So that's going to have to be the more important call to action. And then the other link is kind of secondary.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think in terms of call to actions, I think that there's also something, just to support everything that you've said, that has to be thought through ahead of time. And again, it's part of the design, but it's also part of the copy. So if you're thinking about the copy that's going to go into a particular section, take it a step further and think, okay, so what are the words that are going to take people to the next step where I want them to go? Is it going to be read more, learn more, tell me how? Or, there's so many different options that you have, but I think call to actions are probably, the one of the most important things on the page when you're thinking through design and copy. And so the last question that we have, most of the questions that, that we've answered this already, but, just to finish it up, what are some important things to know for mobile design? When should mobile design be focused on? And we know it's very, very important, but is there anything else that you can tell us when we're thinking through mobile that we should just really pay attention to? And, again, this question came in now, but it is a really good way to finish up the conversation, because it is more often than you would think. I think it's forgotten.
I think one thing we didn't really touch on is just like the bells and whistles with mobile. It's really hard on a mobile phone. This is going way back, but some things don't support Flash. You want to keep in mind, and that's, like I said, very, very dated, but keep in mind what the phone is going to support, and make sure that you're thinking about what they're seeing. So if you have something that is a hover, people have to hover over it to see it, make sure that it has some kind of a call to action or something above it, and they know what's underneath. Because otherwise, they're just going to see the top of the hover, and they're like, okay, there's a red box. Why should I click on it? You want to make sure that you're guiding them through the experience, even despite any limitations that they may have on their phone. And, like I said, it's the same thing. We've talked about it before, but the navigation, the hamburger menu is because people can't read and click on the tiny little text links at the top. How are you accommodating for this different experience and the limitations that this experience has? And how are you using those limitations to your advantage?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that I've seen that I find really cool whenever I jump on a site on my phone is some sites, if you want people to call you. So not every business, wants people calling them. A lot of businesses, they prefer they reach out through a contact form or through a chat. But to call, that one-click call. So if I'm holding my phone in my hand, I can reach one button to call using my thumb. Takes me, a lot less time than having to find and click on the phone number. So to your point, there are a lot of fun bells and whistles that you can add when you're thinking through the mobile experience that you wouldn't normally use on a desktop.
Yeah. I definitely think it's about thinking about utilizing it to the best advantage that you can.
Mm-hmm. So this was a lot of fun today. Thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot. I think everybody learned a lot. And, hopefully now when it comes to thinking through the web design, or even working with your web designer, or understanding how much time and effort goes into every single piece of your site, and, making it a collaborative experience, this is just, I think that it's just gave us a lot of food for thought. So thank you for your time today. And I'm really looking forward to a lot of future conversations, because I think we touched on a lot of topics we could expand on in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, excellent. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And we will be having another webinar in 2 weeks. And I look forward to talking to everybody then. Have a great weekend.